In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, flames danced hundreds of feet into the night sky. The merchant vessel, SS Zaafaran, was dying, her hull torn open by a German torpedo, her cargo holds erupting in cascading explosions. 200 men clung to her burning decks, trapped between the inferno behind them and the ice-cold sea below. This is the story of the small boat that rescued 200 men from a burning ship. March 17, 1941. Position: 5,912 feet N, 1940, approximately 240 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. The 5,800-ton British merchant vessel SS Zaafaran, traveling as part of Convoy HX-112, had just been struck by 2 torpedoes from the German submarine U-99, commanded by the legendary Kapitän-Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer. The attack came at 02 for 7 hours, in darkness so complete that the first warning most crew members had was the thunderous explosion that lifted the ship's stern clear out of the water. The SS Zaafaran was no ordinary merchant vessel. Built in 1921 by Lithgow's Limited in Port Glasgow, she had spent 2 decades hauling cargo across the world's oceans. But in March of 1941, she carried something far more precious than manufactured goods or raw materials. Aboard the Zaafaran were 147 merchant seamen from ships previously sunk in the Atlantic, survivors being transported back to Britain for reassignment. Combined with her own crew of 53, the ship carried exactly 200 souls. The convoy's escort consisted of 5 destroyers and 2 corvettes. Pitifully inadequate protection against the wolfpack gathering in the darkness, HMS Vannock and HMS Walker, Vic-class destroyers under the command of Captain Donald McIntyre, led the escort group. But in the vast emptiness of the North Atlantic, 7 escort vessels, protecting 41 merchant ships, meant that each escort was responsible for covering approximately 8 square miles of ocean. It was an impossible task. Lieutenant Commander James Wallace commanded the Zaafaran. At 43 years old, he was a veteran of the First World War who had returned to sea service when Britain called. His first officer, Malcolm Henderson, was half his age, a young Scotsman from Aberdeen who had joined the Merchant Navy in 1938, just in time to see his profession transform from peaceful commerce to deadly gamble with every voyage. The strategic situation that March night was desperate. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered its most critical phase. German U-boats operating in coordinated wolfpacks were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. In February alone, the Allies had lost 196,000 tons of shipping. March would prove even worse. Every ship that went down brought Britain one step closer to starvation, one step closer to defeat. The evening of March 16th had been deceptively calm. A cold front moving south from Greenland had brought clear skies. It's unusual for the North Atlantic in March. The convoy zigzagged according to standard defensive pattern, changing course every 20 minutes to confuse any submarines that might be tracking them. The sea was moderate, rolling in long, lazy swells that lifted the ships gently before setting them down again. Aboard the Zaafaran, the atmosphere was subdued. The survivors from previous sinkings knew exactly what they faced. Many had already been torpedoed once, some twice. They moved through the ship quietly, keeping to themselves, their eyes carrying that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much death. The Zaafaran's regular crew tried to maintain routine, but tension hung over the vessel like a shroud. At 2,200 hours, the convoy executed its scheduled nighttime course change, swinging from heading 08 to 2095. The Zaafaran occupied position 4-3 in the convoy formation, 4th column, 3rd row. It was a relatively protected position, surrounded by other ships. But in the North Atlantic wolfpack tactics, no position was truly safe. What Lieutenant Commander Wallace didn't know, what no one in the convoy knew, was that 9 German submarines had already gathered around them. The wolfpack, designated Grupp West, had been tracking HX-112 for 18 hours. U-99, U-100, U-110, U-37, U-74, U-98, U-69, UA, and U-552 formed a loose cordon around the convoy, waiting for nightfall to begin their attack. Otto Kretschmer in U-99 was the ace among aces. With 238,327 tons of Allied shipping already sent to the bottom, he was Germany's most successful U-boat commander. His tactics were simple and brutally effective. Wait until full darkness, surface inside the convoy where ASDIC sonar couldn't detect him, and fire at point-blank range. He called it surface night attack, and it had made him a legend among U-boat crews and a nightmare for Allied convoys. By midnight, Kretschmer had positioned U-99 perfectly. The submarine had slipped between 2 columns of merchant ships, completely undetected. At 0115 hours, he fired his first spread of torpedoes. The tanker Aerodona exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire convoy. Chaos erupted. Ships began emergency turns, colliding with each other in the darkness. Star shells burst overhead as the escorts desperately tried to illuminate attacking submarines. U-2-100, commanded by Joachim Schepke, struck next. The freighter J.B. White took a torpedo amidships and began to settle, then the Franche-Comte, then the Venetia. In less than 30 minutes, 4 ships were sinking or already gone. Aboard the Zaafaran, Lieutenant Commander Wallace ordered full ahead, trying to maneuver his vessel out of the killing zone. The ship's ancient engines strained, pushing her to her maximum speed of 11 knots. Anderson stood beside him on the bridge, both men scanning the darkness with binoculars, knowing that somewhere out there, death was hunting them. At 0240 hours, the lookout in the Zaafaran's crow's nest spotted a white wake cutting through the water, heading directly for the ship's port side. He opened his mouth to scream a warning, but the words hadn't left his lips when the first torpedo struck. The explosion occurred in the number 3 cargo hold, 20 feet below the waterline. The blast wave traveled through the ship's structure like an earthquake, buckling steel plates, shattering portholes, throwing men from their bunks. The lights went out instantly, plunging the ship into absolute darkness, broken only by the emergency lighting system, which flickered uncertainly before steadying. Wallace knew immediately that his ship was mortally wounded. The Zaafaran began listing to port almost instantly, tilting at an angle that increased by the second. But he also knew that with 200 men aboard, abandoning ship in the North Atlantic at night was almost certainly a death sentence. The water temperature was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Man could survive perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia shut down his body. Most would die in less than 10. Damage report. Wallace shouted into the speaking tube, but there was no response. The communication system was dead. He sent Henderson below to assess the situation personally. The first officer returned 4 minutes later, his face grim. Number 3 hold is completely flooded. Number 4 is taking water fast. The bulkhead between 3 and 4 won't hold, it's already buckling. We've got steam lines ruptured in the engine room, Chief says. We've lost all power to the pumps. Wallace made his calculation quickly. At the current rate of flooding, the Zaafaran had perhaps 15 minutes before she went down. Prepare to abandon ship, he ordered. But don't lower the boats yet. Signal the escorts, tell them we need immediate assistance. The radio operator began transmitting the distress call. SSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSssssssssssssssssssssss aboard. Then Kretschmer struck again. The second torpedo hit at 0247 hours, this time striking the engine room directly. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire midsection of the ship erupted in flames as fuel oil ignited. Men working in the engine room died instantly, incinerated in temperatures that reached 3,000 degrees. The blast blew out the side of the ship, creating a hole 20 feet wide through which the North Atlantic began to pour. But worse than the water was the fire. The Zaafaran's cargo included 800 tons of industrial alcohol, destined for British factories. When the second torpedo ruptured those containers, the alcohol spread across the water inside the holds and ignited. Flames raced through the ship's interior with terrifying speed. Within 2 minutes, fire had engulfed the entire midship section. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, illuminated from below by dancing orange flames that reflected off the low clouds. Men began pouring onto the deck, many of them burned, some with clothing on fire. The survivors from previous sinkingsmen, who had sworn they would never go into the North Atlantic again, now faced exactly that prospect. Some were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Others ran to the lifeboats, only to discover that 3 of the 4 boats had been destroyed in the explosions or were now surrounded by flames. Wallace stood on the bridge wing, watching his command die. The list to port had increased to 20 degrees and was accelerating. The bow was rising as the stern settled deeper. Fire engulfed everything amidships. You could hear men screaming, could smell burning flesh, mixed with the acrid stench of burning oil and alcohol. The Zaafaran had, at most, 10 minutes left. In the freezing North Atlantic waters, 200 men faced an impossible choice: burn to death on a sinking ship or jump into water cold enough to kill them in minutes. The forward section of the Zaafaran, not yet fully engulfed by flames, had become a desperate refuge. Men crowded onto the foredeck, as far from the inferno as possible, knowing that every second brought them closer to the moment when they would have to choose their death. The single surviving lifeboat hung uselessly in its davits, blocked by the ship's increasing list. At 25 degrees of tilt, it was impossible to launch properly. Several crewmen tried anyway, attacking the tackle with desperate strength, but the boat swung inward, crashing against the ship's superstructure. On the bridge, Wallace made the hardest decision of his life. "Abandon ship," he ordered. "All hands abandon ship. Every man for himself." The order was relayed throughout the forward section. Men began going over the side, jumping feet first into the dark water below. The drop from the main deck to the ocean was normally 30 feet, but with the Zaafaran's bow rising at an angle, some men were jumping from 45 feet or more. Several were injured in the impact, hitting the water wrong, breaking legs or backs. Those who survived the jump faced immediate shock. The 39-degree water hit like a physical blow, driving the air from their lungs, causing their hearts to race, triggering an overwhelming panic response. Men who had been good swimmers all their lives found themselves unable to coordinate their movements. Some went under immediately, their bodies seized by cold water shock. Others thrashed at the surface, their life jackets keeping them afloat, but their arms and legs already going numb. The Zaafaran's lights were still functioning in the forward section, creating an eerie illumination across the water. In that light, Wallace could see his men dying. Some floated face down, already gone. Others called out for help, their voices growing weaker. Few tried to swim away from the ship, but in water that cold, swimming was nearly impossible. Most simply floated, conserving what little energy they had, knowing they had minutes at best. Henderson appeared at Wallace's side. "Sir, you need to go now." Wallace shook his head. "Not yet. The escorts will come. They have to come." But where were they? HMS Walker, the nearest escort, was 3 miles away, dealing with another attack. Commander McIntyre had detected a submarine on Azdic and was prosecuting the contact, dropping depth charges in a determined effort to kill the U-boat that had devastated his convoy. He knew the Zaafaran was in trouble, had received a distress call, but his primary duty was to protect the rest of the convoy, to kill submarines before they could strike again. HMS Vannock, the second destroyer, was 5 miles to the north, chasing what turned out to be a false contact. The corvettes were even farther away. In the chaos of a wolfpack attack, every escort vessel was engaged with threats, trying desperately to protect 41 merchant ships from 9 submarines. One ship with 200 men aboard, no matter how desperate their situation, could not take priority over the survival of the entire convoy. The Zaafaran continued to die. The list increased to 30 degrees. The bow rose higher, the stern sinking deeper. The fire had reached the forward cargo holds now, and men trapped on the foredeck found themselves being pushed toward the edge by the advancing flames. They had nowhere left to go. At 0254, hours just 7 minutes after the second torpedo strikes, something impossible appeared out of the darkness. A small boat, no more than 26 feet long, emerged from between 2 merchant ships in the convoy. It was the motor launch from the SS Alderpool, a merchantman in position 3-2, directly adjacent to where the Zaafaran had been before she was hit. The launch was designed to carry perhaps 12 people in calm conditions. Tonight, in the North Atlantic swell, with men dying in the water and a ship burning like a torch behind them, the tiny craft looked absurdly inadequate. But at the helm was Chief Officer Martin Krauss, a 38-year-old Norwegian who had escaped his homeland just ahead of the German invasion. Beside him were 3 volunteers from the Alderpool's crew: Second Officer David Thompson, able seaman Jack Riley, and 17-year-old cabin boy Thomas Harrington, who had lied about his age to join the merchant navy and was on only his second Atlantic crossing. Krause had not requested permission to launch the boat. His captain would likely have refused sending 4 men into a submarine-infested war zone to rescue survivors from a burning ship was, by any rational calculation, suicide. But Krause had watched the Zaafaran die, had seen men jumping into the freezing water, and had made a choice that transcended logic or military protocol. "We're going to save them," he had told his 3 volunteers. All of them. Thompson had laughed, thinking it was a grim joke. "Chief, there's 200 men on that ship. Then we'd better get started," Krause replied. The motor launch, powered by a small diesel engine that sputtered and coughed in the cold air, crossed the 400 yards between the Alderpool and the Zaafaran in less than 3 minutes. As they approached, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Men floated everywhere in the water, some calling for help, others ominously silent. The Zaafaran towered above them, her bow pointing at the sky, flames consuming her midsection, explosions continuing to ripple through her hull as cargo ignited. "We'll start with the men in the water," Krause shouted over the roar of flames and the diesel engine's clatter. "Work from the farthest out toward the ship. The ones in the water won't last long. They reached the first survivor at 0255 hours. He was a merchant seaman from one of the previously sunk ships. A young man named Peter Collins, who had already been torpedoed twice before. Riley and Harrington grabbed his arms and hauled him aboard with desperate strength. Collins couldn't speak, couldn't move. His lips were blue, his eyes glazed with hypothermia's deadly fog. "Keep moving," Krause ordered, already steering toward the next man. They pulled aboard William Scott, an engineer from Glasgow, then Robert Mitchell, an able seaman from Liverpool, and Patrick O'Brien, a fireman from Cork. One after another, they hauled dying men from the water. Some could help themselves a little, grabbing at the launch's gunnels. Others were dead weight, their bodies limp and unresponsive. Riley and Harrington strained their backs, lifting men who outweighed them by 50 pounds or more. The launch was designed to carry 12 people. After 10 minutes, they had 25 men aboard. The boat sat dangerously low in the water, waves lapping at the gunnels. Any swell larger than normal would swamp them. "We need to offload," Thompson said. "No time," Krause replied. He steered the overloaded launch toward the nearest merchant ship, the SS Icarus, 300 yards away. The Icarus had maintained its position in the convoy formation, neither stopping nor turning back, standard procedure during submarine attack. To stop was to become a stationary target. To turn back was to risk collision with other ships and to create confusion that submarines could exploit. But the Icarus's crew had been watching. As the launch approached, men lined the rail, throwing down rope ladders. One by one, the 25 survivors were passed up the ship's side. It was agonizingly slow work. Each man had to be helped to grab the ladder and supported from below while the Icarus's crew hauled from above. Men slipped, their frozen fingers unable to grip the ropes. 2 fell back into the launch, requiring second attempts. 11 minutes to transfer 25 men. Krause didn't wait for the last man to clear the ladder. "We're going back," he shouted, and opened the throttle. At 0308 hours, Krause brought the motor launch back to the Zaafaran's killing field. In the 13 minutes since they'd left, the situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The merchant vessel's list had increased to 40 degrees. Her stern was now completely underwater, her propeller visible above the surface, still slowly turning. The fire had engulfed everything aft of the bridge, and flames were advancing forward along the starboard side. Men who had initially jumped from the main deck now clung to the bow rails, the rising angle forcing them to climb higher and higher. Some had already given up and jumped, adding to the dozens already in the water. Others hung on with failing strength, knowing that to jump was to die, but unable to force themselves to make that final leap. Wallace remained on the bridge, but the bridge was no longer horizontal. He stood at a 40-degree angle, holding onto the compass binnacle to keep from sliding backward into the flames. Henderson was still with him, refusing to abandon his captain. The second rescue run followed the pattern of the first, but with even more desperate urgency. Krause maneuvered the launch through the floating men, Riley and Harrington hauling bodies aboard with methodical desperation. They were getting better at it. Lift under the arms, roll them over the gunwale, drag them to the center of the boat. They worked with assembly line efficiency, not thinking about the human cost of each second's delay. This time, they pulled 31 men from the water before the launch couldn't take another ounce of weight. The boat wallowed like a drunk, water pouring in over the sides with every swell. Young Harrington was bailing constantly with a bucket, throwing water over the side as fast as he could, knowing it was a losing battle but doing it anyway. They made their way back to the Icarus. Transfer, 11 more minutes. Back to the Zaafaran, third run, 27 men. Fourth run, 23 men, including 5 who had finally jumped from the Zaafaran's bow. By 0335 hours, they had rescued 106 men. Nearly 100 remained, most of them now trapped on the ship's bow, which pointed almost vertically at the sky. The Zaafaran was in her death throes, her keel breaking, her hull groaning with sounds like a living creature in agony. Explosions continued to ripple through her structure as pockets of trapped air heated to critical temperatures. "She's going to go," Thompson said. "Chief, we need to stay clear. When she goes down, the suction will take us with her." Krause looked at the men clinging to the bow rails. He could see their faces in the firelight, terror and exhaustion, and the knowledge of certain death. "One more run," he said. "Chief, one more run." This time, they didn't go to the men in the water first. They brought the launch directly alongside the Zaafaran's bow, now rising 30 feet above them. It was insanely dangerous. The ship was unstable, rolling unpredictably, threatening to capsize at any second and crush the tiny boat beneath thousands of tons of steel. "Jump!" Krause shouted up at the men. "Jump now! We'll catch you!" The first man jumped, his arms windmilling, and hit the water 3 feet from the launch. Riley grabbed him before he could sink. The second man landed directly in the boat, nearly capsizing it. The third missed completely, hitting the water 10 feet away, and went under. Kraus steered toward where he disappeared, and miraculously, the man surfaced. Harrington grabbed his hair and held his head above water while Riley hauled him aboard. More men jumped. Some landed in the boat. Some landed in the water and had to be fished out. One man missed the water entirely and hit the launch's gunnel, breaking his arm with an audible crack but somehow maintaining enough presence of mind to roll inboard rather than fall back into the sea. The launch was beyond overloaded now. Water poured in steadily. The diesel engine labored, barely able to move the weight. 34 men, all told. The boat was carrying nearly 3 times its designed capacity. They sat low enough that fish could have swum aboard. "That's it," Thompson said. "We can't take another person. Chief, we have to go." But there were still men on the Zaafaran's bow, perhaps 40 of them, clinging to rails that were now nearly vertical, looking down at the impossibly overloaded launch below them, knowing there was no more room. And that's when Lieutenant Commander Wallace appeared at the bow rail. He had made his way forward through the blazing ship, navigating passages filled with smoke and flame, driven by the captain's ultimate responsibility to be the last man to leave his ship. Henderson was beside him, loyal to the end. "How many more can you take?" Wallace shouted down. "None," Thompson called back. "Sir, we're sinking ourselves." Wallace looked at the 40 men still trapped on his dying ship. He looked at the overloaded launch, made his calculation. "Henderson," he said quietly, "I'm ordering you to jump." "Not without you, sir. That's not a request." "Number 1, jump." Henderson looked at his captain, seeing the resolution in the older man's eyes. He understood. If everyone jumped, the launch would be swamped and everyone would die. Someone had to stay behind, had to sacrifice themselves so others could live. And the captain's privilege, the captain's duty, was to be that someone. But before Henderson could respond, something extraordinary happened. The men trapped on the bow began climbing down the outside of the ship's hull. They didn't jump. They climbed, hand over hand, using the ship's rivets and portholes as handholds, descending the near-vertical surface like rock climbers rappelling down a cliff face. It should have been impossible. The hull was slick with water and oil. The angle was brutal. And these were exhausted men who had already endured unimaginable stress. But they did it anyway. The first man to reach the water was grabbed immediately by Riley. They hauled him into the launch, which now sat with barely 6 inches of freeboard. The second man came down, then the third, then the fourth. Kraus made a decision that defied every rule of seamanship. "We're not going back to the Icarus," he announced. "We're going to ride low and take them all. Every single one." "Chief, we can't," Thompson began. "We can. We will. Pass the word everyone in this boat needs to bail. Use anything. Shh. Cups, hats, your hands. We keep the water out, we keep moving, and we save them all." It was madness. It was beautiful. The men in the launch began bailing with whatever they could find. Some used their shoes. Others cupped their hands. The men being rescued were put to work bailing the moment they came aboard. No time for hypothermia. No time for injury. Just bail or die. One by one, the men climbed down the Zaafaran's hull and were pulled into the launch. 35 men. 45. The boat should have sunk. By every law of physics and buoyancy, it should have gone straight to the bottom. But somehow, through sheer willpower and constant bailing, it stayed afloat. At 03 for 2 hours, with 51 people aboard a boat designed for 12, with the gunnels actually underwater and only forward motion keeping them from sinking, the last man came down from the Zaafaran's bow. It was Lieutenant Commander Wallace. Henderson had jumped 2 minutes earlier, following his captain's direct order. Now Wallace hung from a porthole 30 feet above the water, looking down at the impossibly overloaded launch below him. He could see every face in the firelight, could see the desperation and determination of men who had already pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. "Sir!" Krause shouted up. "You need to jump now. She's going." Wallace could feel the ship shuddering beneath his hands. The final breakup was seconds away. He let go. The impact drove the launch nearly underwater. Men on both sides grabbed Wallace, hauled him aboard with the last reserves of their strength. The boat wallowed, listing heavily to starboard, water pouring in faster than they could bail. "Go!" Riley screamed. "Chief, go!" Krause opened the throttle all the way. The diesel engine roared, black smoke pouring from the exhaust. The launch began to move slowly at first, then faster. Water streamed from the gunnels, as forward motion and 52 men bailing simultaneously began to overcome the flooding. They were 20 yards from the Zaafaran when she went. The ship's keel broke with a sound like artillery fire. The bow and stern, no longer connected, began to sink independently. The bow went first, sliding backward into the water with the terrible groaning of tearing metal. The stern followed seconds later, flames still burning, even as the ocean claimed it. The entire midsection, now completely disintegrated, simply collapsed into the sea. The suction was enormous. It grabbed the launch, pulling it backward toward the vortex where the ship had been. Krauss fought the wheel, keeping the bow pointed away, the engine screaming at maximum revolutions. For 3 eternal seconds, they made no progress, the launch held in place by the dying ship's final grip. Then they broke free. The motor launch, carrying 52 men, wallowed through the North Atlantic swell for 23 minutes before reaching the SS Icarus. By that time, HMS Walker had finally arrived in the area, having destroyed U-99 with depth charges. Commander McIntyre would later learn that he had killed Otto Kretschmer, Germany's ace of aces, had been forced to surface and was now a prisoner of war aboard Walker. But McIntyre's greatest concern that night wasn't the submarine commander he'd captured. It was the 200 men from the Zaafaran. As dawn broke over the North Atlantic on March 17, 1941, the final count became clear. Of the 200 men aboard the SS Zaafaran when she was torpedoed, 194 had survived. 6 men had died, the 4 engineers killed instantly in the second torpedo strike, and 2 men who had succumbed to hypothermia in the water before the motor launch could reach them. It was by any measure miraculous. The survivors were distributed among 4 ships in the convoy. The SS Icarus carried 127, having received the bulk of the rescued men. The SS Alderpool took 45, including the 21 men from the launch's final. HMS Walker took 18, pulled from the water by the destroyer's crew, and 4 men, including Lieutenant Commander Wallace, were aboard HMS Vannock, having been rescued by the corvette during the final chaotic minutes. Of the 194 survivors, 87 required medical treatment for hypothermia, injuries, or burns. Young Thomas Harrington, the 17-year-old cabin boy who had bailed water for nearly an hour straight, was hospitalized in Liverpool with exhaustion and exposure, but recovered fully. Chief Officer Martin Krauss suffered frostbite on his hands and feet. He had repeatedly entered the water to help pull men aboard, sacrificing his gloves to survivors who needed them more. The full story of the rescue didn't emerge immediately. In the chaos of convoy operations and the ongoing battle for the Atlantic, it was simply recorded that the SS Zaafaran had been sunk with minimal loss of life. The official convoy report filed by Commander McIntyre noted, "Motor launch from SS Alderpool rendered valuable assistance in rescue operations." It wasn't until the survivors reached Liverpool and began telling their stories that the magnitude of what had happened became clear. Newspaper reports called it the miracle of Convoy HX-112. The London Times ran a front page story with the headline, "Small Boat Saves 200 from Burning Ship." In July 1941, King George VI awarded Martin Krauss the George Medal for Gallantry. David Thompson, Jack Riley, and Thomas Harrington each received the British Empire Medal. The award ceremony at Buckingham Palace was brief. Britain was fighting for its survival, and there was little time for elaborate celebrations. But when the king pinned the medal to Krauss's uniform, he reportedly asked, "How did you fit them all in the boat?" Krauss's answer was characteristically modest. "We just did, Your Majesty. We couldn't not do it." Lieutenant Commander James Wallace received no award. As captain of a ship lost to enemy action, he was subject to the standard board of inquiry to determine if he had acted properly. The board exonerated him completely, finding that he had handled his vessel with skill and had shown exemplary leadership during the abandonment of his ship. He was given command of another merchant vessel, the SS Torrington, in September 1941. Wallace survived the war, making 17 more Atlantic crossings before retiring from sea service in 1945. He never spoke publicly about the night the Zaafaran died, maintaining the traditional captain's reticence about disasters at sea. He died in 1968, aged 70, in his home in Southampton. Martin Krauss returned to sea after recovering from his injuries. He made 31 more Atlantic crossings during the war, surviving 3 more torpedo attacks. In 1943, he was given command of his own vessel, the SS Bergen, and brought her safely through the war. After 1945, he continued working in the merchant navy until his retirement in 1961. He died in 1982, aged 79, in Oslo. Of the 194 survivors from the Zaafaran, 167 returned to sea service. 23 of them were killed in subsequent sinkings during the remaining 4 years of war. The Merchant Navy suffered higher casualty rates than any other British service during World War II. 1 in 4 merchant seamen died. They received no medals, no parades, and were often forgotten in post-war commemorations that focused on the armed services. The motor launch that performed the impossible rescue continued in service aboard the SS Alderpool for the remainder of the war. In 1946, when the Alderpool was sold for scrap, a crewman named William Stevens purchased the launch privately, intending to restore it as a fishing boat. Instead, he donated it to the Imperial War Museum, where it was placed in storage. In 1995, a museum researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Morgan discovered the launch while cataloging items in the museum's warehouse. She spent 2 years researching its history, tracking down surviving crew members and interviewing witnesses. Her resulting book, The Small Boat, One Night in the North Atlantic, published in 1998, brought the story back to public attention. The launch was restored and is now on permanent display at the Imperial War Museum in London. A plaque beside it reads, "Motor launch from SS Alderpool." On the night of March 17, 1941, this 26-foot boat rescued 194 men from the burning merchant vessel SS Zaafaran in the North Atlantic. The rescue stands as one of the most remarkable feats of seamanship and courage in maritime history. 200 men went into the North Atlantic on a freezing March night in 1941. They faced burning oil, freezing water, and the certainty of death. They were saved by 4 men in a small boat who refused to accept the impossible, who made 7 trips into a killing zone when 1 trip should have killed them, who bent the laws of physics through sheer determination, and saved lives when every rational calculation said those lives were already lost. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Secrets, reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.